Hi, this is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today we have a special guest, guy I am super duper excited to have on. I listened to so much of his work in my formative years. Some of the records that he worked on were some of my favorite records when I was a teenager, but he has been working prolifically for the past 30 or more years, probably, in audio. Guy named Jack Endino. Jack, thanks so much for joining us today.
A pleasure, Justin. Thanks for having me on.
Great to have you here, man. So really excited to have you. There's so much I want to ask you about. In case you're not familiar with Jack Endino, he really made his name for himself in the beginning, working with some of the biggest bands of the kind of grunge era in the Pacific Northwest. He worked on Nirvana's Bleach, which, full disclosure, was an album I listened to literally every single morning when I was 13 for like a year, and I learned every song on that record. He worked with Mudhoney. I think he did some stuff with Soundgarden. You did L7's first EP. Pretty much, you think of a grunge band, you name them. Jack Endino, if you didn't work with them directly, probably knew them very well. So super excited to have him on. But ever since then, he's made a huge career for himself going forward. One of the most prolific guys, I think, working in these styles of music, and really excited to hear what he's been doing lately as well. He's made a move into doing more mastering recently, which I want to hear about. And I assume the kinds of tools and approaches that he's used over the years have changed. So I really want to talk to him about all that and a whole lot more. We'll get into it and try to answer as many of your nerdy audio and studio questions that we can with Jack Endino. Before we get into it, a quick shout out to this week's sponsors. Big thanks to Sound Toys sponsoring this podcast from the beginning, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. Also, big shout out and thanks to Antelope Audio. I'm speaking into one of their lovely Axino modeling microphones right now, the most affordable standalone modeling microphone out there. Definitely check them out over at Antelope Audio. They make a great line of interfaces as well as killer software effects. Also, last but not least, another big thanks to Focusrite. If you're looking for just good quality front end, they're another great bet to go with, from their entry-level Scarlett line all the way up to the high-end RedNet series. All right, let's get right into this episode. Jack, thanks again for being here. So, first question, you're still in the Pacific Northwest, yeah?
Yes. Yeah, still based in Seattle.
And you're working mostly out of one studio these days, right?
Mostly out of a studio called Sound House here in Seattle, actually. You know, occasionally I'm in other places. I mean, I have, pretty much anyone in a studio here in Seattle doesn't mind getting a phone call from me if I want to book some time. But, because I happen to rent a house right by Sound House, so I'm kind of, I'm here all the time. I'm actually the guy who even takes the garbage out.
All right. One of the exciting things we get to talk about today, in addition to the work you do for other bands, are your own bands. You're in a few of them, and you're coming out with your own solo record this month, and it's coming out in the month of December. Can you tell us a little bit about the solo record? You haven't put one out, I think, in 10, 15 years, something like that. What prompted you to do it, and what kind of stuff is in store for us on your latest record?
Well, I started making solo records even while I was in the band Skin Yard back in the 80s. I think my first solo record, Angle of Attack, came out in 89, in between Skin Yard albums. And my next record, which was called Endino's Earthworm, came out in, I think, 92, right after Skin Yard had folded. And the following decade, which, the 90s and a little beyond, I kind of rode the grunge wave and ended up going to make records in many, many foreign countries and just getting all over the place, because it was obvious to me by 1991, as grunge was kind of exploding, that the world was much more interested in me as a record producer than as a guitar player. So I kind of rolled with it and, finally took my own career seriously as a record producer after my band Skin Yard had broken up. And that ended up being a very busy decade for me. At a certain point, I kind of missed playing, and I said, this is stupid. I need to keep making music. This is a big part of my life. So I started working on what would have been my third solo record. Almost had it finished by 1999, and then a lot of other stuff happened in my life that kind of derailed it. And then I wrote more songs, blah, blah, blah. Long story short, the third solo record finally came out in 2005. 13 years after the previous solo record, which was, that was the Angle of Attack record, which my friend Sluggo from Wondertaker Records helped me put out. So that was the last record I did. And then I ended up joining some more bands and playing some more shows and doing some more tours and started writing new material. And I ended up working on another record, which was supposed to come out in 2012. And it was going to be called Set Myself on Fire, which is the title of the new album. And I was on a label called Finn Records, which managed to put out an EP for me, which was called the Rumble EP. And it's basically, he fell in love with my cover of Link Wray's Rumble and decided to make a single of it. And I said, all right, whatever you want to do to promote it. And then the label went under. And then I wrote some more songs and got a new band and went back to the drawing board on that record. And now, finally, there is a record called Set Myself on Fire, which is coming out now. So, I'm running about, a decade plus between solo albums now, which is a little on the slow side, I must admit.
Right. Yes, it's not what you're doing if making your own music is the only part of your career, but clearly for a long time, since the 80s and 90s, making your own music hasn't been the only part of your career. And I actually want to go back in time a little bit. Back in, I guess it would be like around 89 that you did Bleach, if I remember correctly. It was roughly that year.
Yes.
And you worked with Soundgarden, I think around the same time, just the tail end of the 80s. At that point, you were in Skin Yard, which didn't disband until 92, which is kind of after Nirvana broke and grunge broke. What was the balance like between your own career and being a studio producer engineer? Because there was some serious overlap there where you were taking Skin Yard seriously and where you were, I assume, also taking your work as an audio guy seriously. How did you see yourself at that time? Were you a guitar player and a musician who was moonlighting doing audio stuff or vice versa? And how did you delineate that in your brain and when did it change?
I was trying to take myself seriously as a musician in the 80s. I was actually in 3 bands at one point. I was playing drums in a surf band called the Crypt Kicker 5 for 5 years. This was not a grunge band. It was a completely different scene here in Seattle. I was playing bass with a fellow named Terry Lee Hale in a band called The Ones, which was kind of a sort of a speed punk bluegrass electric band, a strange band. We have an album's worth recorded, but it's never been released. And I was playing guitar in Skin Yard, and this was in like a roughly 86 through 89. I was playing in all 3 bands and still working at Reciprocal Recording and making records. And because I'm a music nerd, I want to play all the time. But the grunge thing began exploding, and the world was primarily interested in me as a record producer, which I sort of resisted for a long time. And then finally, by the early 90s, when my bands had all folded, I decided, well, let's do what the world wants me to be doing here and follow this producer thing and, take it seriously finally. Because prior to that time, it's rare to see any of those records from the 80s that say produced by Jackendino on them because, I just didn't feel like what I was doing really satisfied the definition I had in my head of what a producer does. Because when you're making a record in 3 days, it's kind of like get out of the way. Get the sounds and stay the heck out of the way and let the band make the record, and just make sure it sounds good. There's not a lot of like getting involved in the song arrangements or, let's go get a different drum set or any of this stuff that you do when you have more time. But nonetheless, everybody started calling me a record producer before I myself had the courage to do so. But then in the 90s, that changed, and people started treating me like a king. And I was like, well, I guess I'm a record producer. So, your mileage may vary because you may not have a record like, Nirvana's first record at the beginning of your career. I suppose I got lucky. I was in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, well, even when you were primarily working in a way that you would consider being an engineer, were you doing those kinds of things that are often associated with record producers and kind of coaching performances and the like? I mean, is that always something that's been part of it? Or are there skills that you developed that you consider record producer skills that came after people started calling you a record producer?
Well, there were skills, of course, but no, I was doing exactly what I've always done. I just didn't realize it was producing, because here's the thing. My first instrument was drums. I switched to bass. I became best known as a guitar player. So I'm very comfortable with all of that stuff. I know the tools. I know what the musicians are using. I can literally look and go, I can listen and go, yeah, this drum set doesn't sound right. Let me play with the tuning on it. You know what I mean? Because by now I know how to tune a kit. I know how to intonate a guitar. I know how to bias a tube amp. I mean, all of this stuff is just second nature to me. So being a musician gave me a tremendous advantage as a record producer because I could take care of the physical aspect of things. Was like, I was taking care of the gear and the tools that they were using to try and record, and which will allow them to concentrate more on the music.
So I think that's actually one of the most underrated skills when it comes to making records sound good. A lot of people who are into studio stuff think first and foremost about microphones or, God forbid, which preamp should I use? And it's not to say these things don't make a difference. They do, but they probably don't make as much of a difference as a well-tuned drum kit, the right snare drum for the song, that kind of thing. So you having that skill set, I think, is a tremendous thing that you can bring to some of these records to figure out, hey, the problem isn't the mic, the problem isn't the EQ, the problem is the snare drum. So is that something that you were doing very early on when you were making records in just 3 days and you had these really quick amounts of time to make records in? Were you helping them with amp settings? Were you helping them with drum selection? Was that part of it even way back then?
Yes, absolutely. Right from day one. And some people don't want to hear that, maybe your amp doesn't sound as good as it should, or maybe your snare drum is really kind of a piece of crap. But what was useful is I always had other amps. There was always some spare drum bits. There was always, okay, you've got a crack cymbal. Let's use mine. Here's a cymbal you can use instead. I always had that stuff laying around. And the other thing is being a musician as part of the music scene that I was actually recording gave me more credibility because I was basically one of the boys in terms of they'd seen me on stage. They knew that I could play. So it wasn't just like some guy who's not respected as a musician themselves, I had additional credibility by being part of that music scene and being known as someone who could play, it's different than just having an engineer say, I don't like your sound.
Were you at all slightly older than some of the people you were working with at that time, or would you have been about the same age as most of the major artists?
No, I was about 4 to 5 years older than most of the people I was recording, actually. Of course, now the difference is somewhat more stark.
Totally understandable. Well, I'd love to just talk about the old days for just a slight bit longer, because early on, when you were making records in the 80s and the 90s, in the beginning, you had, by today's standards, limited track counts, limited access to microphones. If I remember correctly, practically everything on Bleach was recorded with an SM58, if I remember that from past interviews. So maybe you have some insights for those of us who are recording in maybe ideal environments or with not as many lines as we might like to have, because some people these days do want to record drums. They just have a 4-channel interface or an 8-channel interface. And although they have more tracks available, they don't necessarily have more channels available. So what are some of the things that have stuck with you from back then, from your minimalist approach? And what would you recommend for recording live full bands today if you have to take a slightly more minimalist approach that many people do in home studios?
Well, I had a sort of an advantage in starting out. Reciprocal recording, when it started, had an 8-track recorder. So we would typically put the drums on 3 channels, bass on 1 channel, guitar on 2 channels, vocal on whatever was left, with, maybe a vocal and guitar solos sharing a track. You'd punch in and out as appropriate. Mm-hmm. But, I started out recording on a 4-track in my basement. And actually, I think 3 of the songs on the first Skin Yard record are actually 4-track recordings, which means Matt Cameron's drums are on 1 channel. There's 1 bass track, 1 guitar track, and 1 track for vocals and maybe a solo overdub here and there. And, I got pretty good at making 1 track of drums with a little stereo reverb sound realistic. Now, it's true I had Matt Cameron playing drums in my basement at the time. Your mileage, again, may vary somewhat because he's a guy that you can point 1 microphone at and he'll sound good. But the actual fact is I had multiple mics on the drums. I had a little Tapco mixer that would submix the drums down to 1 channel. So I'd make sure that I had a good mono submix of the drums before it hit tape. So when I sort of graduated up to an 8-track machine in 1986, when I started working at Reciprocal Recording, having 3 tracks to record the drums on, that was deluxe. I could have 1 track for the snare and a stereo pair for the rest of the kit. So, and generally what I would do is I would record the kick and the toms a little louder in that mix than I needed to, because I knew that if I needed to bring it down and bring the cymbals up, I could put a stereo compressor across that stereo kit submix. and squash the kick and the toms down and bring up the cymbals. So you sort of plan ahead for what gear you have. So I made it work. That's why a lot of those early grunge records, the kick drum was a little on the loud side, is because it was better that way than having not enough. It drives me crazy if all I can hear is the snare drum on a recording. I want to hear the bottom half of the drummer's body.
I know that was one of the things that I loved about the production style on Bleach, and I think one of the things that turned people on to your work and wanting to work with you is that it was this era of, the kick drum is an important part of rock records. And I really feel like kick drums weren't given their glory in like the pop style of the 80s and in a lot of rock stuff in the 70s. There's certain songs that stand out as having amazing kick drums, like Lucky Man, if you remember that track. But I really feel like in the early 90s is when people got hip to kick drum matters in rock music, and it became almost a war, I feel like, of loudening kick drums over the ensuing decade, which you might be partly responsible for, but I thought it was a really refreshing thing. So in order to get those 3 channels where you have the overhead pair mixed down to 2 channels, toms mixed down to 2 channels, are you using any additional supplemental mics in those early days when you're recording down to 3 channels, or is it just overheads, toms, kick, and snare, and it's just kind of one mic on each? And what kinds of mics were you using back then?
Well, I can tell you it wasn't all SM58s. That probably was a half a joke, actually, that I might have said.
Right.
But I had, and even now, my favorite pair of overheads is still a pair of 414s. And I used to go wide stereo, but I decided I didn't always like that because I like preserving mono compatibility. So my favorite overhead method is stereo XY, cardio.
Oh, sure.
And, if it's 414s or a pair of 87s or even a pair of pencil mics, whatever I can find, I generally prefer large diaphragm condensers over pencils. I just feel like it gets a fatter tone. So you're getting the whole kit from the overhead except the kick drum. So then I have a mic in the kick drum. It's usually a D112. And then maybe a spot mic on the snare, spot mic on the toms, bring that in as appropriate. So even then I had, 421s on the toms, 57 on the snare, 414s on the overheads, D112 on the kick drum. And, I haven't changed that much, except now I use the Josephsons on the toms, the condensers, the one, what's it called? The E22S or something like that. It's a lovely mic. You have to pad it sometimes. And I now use, I'd say either a Beyer M200 or a Shure Beta 58 on top snare. And I discovered the Beta 58 back in the 80s after this mic first came about. I realized that literally anything you would use an SM57 or an SM58 on sounds better with a Shure Beta 58. It's a complete replacement for both of those mics. I have never used a 57 again since then. Anything I would use it on sounds better with the Beta 58.
Interesting.
So I use it on guitar, I use it on snare, and sometimes on punk rock vocals.
Right. There's just a little bit of additional presence, I think, in the Beta, and maybe a tighter hypercardioid pattern, something like that.
I can tell you that the mid-range characteristic on the Beta 58 is much less nasal. It has a much nicer mid-range character. If you A-B between, and I tried this experiment. I literally laid a guitar cab on the floor and I put a circle of microphones around the speaker and, all at the same, geometric arrangement relative to the center of the cone. And I just recorded the same guitar signal simultaneously through 16 channels with it, or however many mics I could fit. I think I was able to fit 8 or 9 mics around it. And then I switched them out for another set of 8 or 9 mics. So I went through this, to determine, let's take a really noisy, distorted guitar sound. Because you see, a studio is like a laboratory. When you don't have clients in there, it's a lab. You can experiment and try stuff and gather data. So I did a mic shootout on a really noisy guitar tone and discovered, here's the one I should be using. The Beta 58 frequently comes out on top in terms of noisy guitar tone because it just has a nice character.
I think we're starting to get nerdy here, and if you don't mind, I'll get slightly nerdier still. We actually sometimes avoid too nerdy tech talk here, but I think you're the guy to do it with because you seem to be a mic aficionado. When you said Beyer 201, I hate to correct, in my opinion, the great Jack Endino, but probably a Beyer M201. the black, almost cigar looking one, right?
Yes, that's the one I meant. Did I say M200? Yeah, there is actually an M200. It's a totally different mic. Yeah, I think it's the 201. It's cylindrical. It's black. It's good on snare. I'm not sure what else it's
that
good
one's
for.
lovely. Yeah, yeah. You use that as top snare?
Yeah, it's good at keeping the hi-hat out.
Right. And another thing, I have two more questions for you around mics on drums. One, do you have a preference? There have been so many 414 models from the original EBs to now the BULSs, which I found to be very kind of woody and full sounding, and then the TL2s, which are really bright and toppy, and then the more recent ones that are brighter still, the XL2s, XLSs. Do you have a preference between 414s, being a lover of that mic?
No, I can't tell them apart except that I don't like the new one quite as much. The new one with the little LEDs on it, kind of like, for one thing, I always forget where I left it because it doesn't have a hard switch on it. It has a little button. It cycles through these the patterns, I prefer the one with the hard physical pattern switch that stays where I left it.
You only have to remember to mute your monitors before moving that polar pattern select switch.
Yeah, there's that too. I'm not that picky about it. As far as something that's picking up cymbals mainly, because that's mostly what it's being used for. I'm not crazy picky about mics. I'm just not. I don't have those kind of ears. I'm more concerned are these good cymbals?
Yeah. That was going to be another question I was going to ask you is when you're using overheads, there's two theories about how to use them. One, they're accent mics for the cymbals where you're getting rid of a lot of low end in them. And two, there's the alternate perspective of these are the main mic drums and we're just supplementing with kick and snare. It sounds like you're more likely to use them just as cymbal mics rather than main tone mics and rely more on the close mics for main tone. How do you think about that relationship between the overheads and the close mics?
You're correct. I generally use them as cymbal mics because I much prefer the tone that I'm getting from the close mics. And generally, the kind of drummers I'm recording are so busy on the cymbals and hi-hat that if I don't use the close mics as my main source, I'm going to get way too much hi-hat in everything. That's just a rock and roll thing. Your mileage may vary. Like if I have a jazz combo, it might be the overheads and a kick drum mic. It might be perfect because they're delicate. He's going to be dainty. He's going to be very dignified on his cymbals. But a wailing rock and roll drummer or punk rock guy or metal guy, he's going to blow everything out with hi-hat if I'm not extremely careful in my miking. So I have to get those close mics right in there and then EQ them however I need to make them sound good, because the closer the mic gets to the drum, it starts to get a little bit unnatural sounding, but at the same time, you're getting rid of all that hi-hat bleed. So it's a trade-off. The drum usually sounds better with the mic pulled back from it, but the bleed is impossible. You get cymbal crash getting into things. You get the ride cymbal getting into your snare mic, because it's right across from where you put the snare mic. I'll do anything to avoid having to gate the drums. Okay? If I have to gate the drums, then my miking has failed. So I mic accordingly so that I do not have to gate the drums because I want to catch the grace notes if there are any. And I just don't like the sound of once I've had to gate it, it's like, okay, now this is triage. Now I'm trying to fix a problem. And it's like, no, I will mic it however I need to do.
That was interesting. That was going to be my next question, what your approach to gating was, and it sounds like you like to avoid it. And I'm also so glad to hear that too much hi-hat and too much cymbals has been a problem for Jack Endino, and it's not just me, because I think that's one of the things that people run into a lot, particularly in rock genres. And even these days, doing mostly mastering, often when it comes to new artists, new producers, one of the biggest problems I find is that I'll get mixes from them that have way too much hi-hat, especially if they mix a little dark, like people will often mix a little dark, and then you brighten things up a hair in mastering and the cymbals come out even more. One thing I'm going to hip you to, I don't know if you've done this, but it changed my world back when I was recording more, was I started miking the hi-hat, not to have a close mic on the hi-hat, but so that I could feed the hi-hat into the drummer's headphones so they wouldn't play it as loud. And that was a trick that has been able to allowed me to slightly de-amplify, young cymbal bashers, because often I think it's a problem with younger drummers where they're just hitting everything with equal force instead of hitting the drums relatively hard and light, slightly lighter on the cymbals. It's just this physical act and they're bashing cymbals as hard as everything else. But as soon as you give them tons of hi-hat in their ears, they change the way they play slightly. So that was a trick that eventually I started using, that once I started using it, I always wanted to have a hi-hat mic just so I could give it to them in the monitors.
Now I like your idea there, Justin, because I've never tried to do that specifically. But it doesn't come up that often. It really doesn't. I mean, most people, I get them to move the hi-hat a few inches away from the snare. This is when I get the drummer who's got the hi-hat an inch from the snare. And I just explain to him, look, here's where the snare mic is. There's where your hi-hat is. I cannot defeat the laws of acoustics here. You've got to give me a little space, move the hi-hat over, please. And they kind of look at it and they go, oh yeah, you're right. Because I go, look, I can't do magic here. If the hi-hat is 2 inches from the snare mic, that's what I'm going to hear. You want a good recording, don't you? And you just got to put it to them in an obvious, commonsensical way like that. And you can get the drummer to move the hi-hat up or over a little bit and he'll adjust to it within a minute or two and it'll be fine. So, you gotta be not afraid to like point these things out.
Yep. Now let me ask you about bass. We talked a little bit about drums and a little bit about guitar. I want to ask you bass real quick, and then I want to move into mastering, and we'll circle back to mixing. But bass, are you a DI guy or an amp guy or both?
I'm an amp guy. I will always have a DI just as an emergency, But, frequently I end up not using very much of the DI in the recording because most of the time the bass sound is just more believable. Now, I might have to EQ it. I might have to EQ it drastically because anyone using 10s, like 10-inch speakers, you're going to have a big hump at 200 hertz. There's going to be a resonance peak. And maybe that's not where I want the bass to be sitting in the mix. So I'm going to look for that resonance peak and try and notch it down. I prefer to record through larger speakers like 15s. I have a double 15 cabinet that I steer people to if possible because I get a much more even low end out of it, even though it doesn't have that plinky high end coming through. It kind of defies my reasoning powers why the guitar player gets 12-inch speakers and the bass player gets 10-inch speakers. I know the theory is it moves the resonant frequency up so that it fills the room more, but it actually makes the low end that you record from the bass really uneven. You get it, like I said, you get a huge peak at 200 hertz and you're like really losing your 40 and 50 hertz fundamental frequencies, which you get back if you record through 15s or, God help you, 18-inch speakers, but you lose the high end. So it's a trade-off. I mean, some of the best setups are like a 15 and 4 10s. You've seen bass cabinets like that. So you can put a mic on the top and get the clanky stuff, put a mic on the bottom and get your low octave nice and even. Okay, the DI is also useful because you can extract a very linear low end out of it if you just get rid of the plinky, clicky high stuff. Just get rid of everything above 3K. And if you can get it phase aligned, which is always kind of a pain in the ass, but if you can get it phase aligned with the mics, you can blend the DI in if you compress the hell out of it and maybe have it be useful. So, I mean, I'll do whatever it takes to get a good bass sound. But by and large, if I go with a DI alone, the bass is going to sound really transparent, and it's just not going to sound like the band sounds live. Right. There's something about air moving in a room, and, you stick a nice mic like an RE20 or a 421 or something like that, or even, for heaven's sake, a large diaphragm condenser that can take the volume. Or one friend of mine likes to use a ribbon mic for his bass, and I get a great sound with that, if you're careful. I like amps. Now, keyboards, I'll probably do a DI on keyboards. They always end up, that's another story. Let's not go there.
All right. Now, talking real quick about bass still, I'd love to get, because you have some interesting ideas there about, different speaker sizes and what part of the frequency spectrum they're accentuating. How do you think about where the bass is supposed to sit compared to the kick? Is this something that varies from record to record, or do you often have an approach where the kick is supposed to sit underneath the bass or the bass is supposed to sit underneath the kick? Do you have particular ideas on how those two elements fit together so they don't get in each other's way?
Yes. Okay, here's the thing. Depending on how you mic the kick drum, you could get sound down to like 30 cycles a second, okay? 30 hertz. Now, the thing is, on any set of small speakers, you're not going to hear that. So you got to make sure that you've got some kick drum up around 100, 200 hertz, and maybe some harmonic, some click up in like the 1 or 2K area, or you're just not going to hear it on small speakers. It's just going to be invisible. So one of the odd things that I ended up doing some years ago that I learned how to do was actually trimming some of the deep subsonic stuff off the kick drum, because it would basically screw up the mastering. You basically would force you to turn the kick drum down to accommodate this extra sub octave. And you'd wind up, if you had giant, massive speakers you were listening to it on, sure, you would hear the kick drum, but on anything small, it would get lost. And I realized that if you actually want to hear the kick drum, you need the bass frequencies around 80 to 120 to come through. You don't need 30 hertz. That's going to actually screw you up. And in fact, it's going to make it impossible to cut vinyl, which is now a factor. As far as the bass goes, you got to remember that the fundamental frequency of low E is 41.2 hertz. But most of what you're hearing coming out of the amp is the harmonic of that, which is 80 hertz. So you want to get a little bit of the fundamental frequency, whether you have to get it from the DI or from a giant speaker or whatever, just to give you that feeling that there's some depth. But what you're mostly hearing is the higher harmonics. So your kick and your bass are both going to be, the useful area for them is going to be around, 80 to 180 hertz in that little zone there. There's about an octave there that is kind of your magic area where the kick and the bass are going to lock together. Now, you don't want a kick drum that has a tone, because if your kick drum has a note, boom, boom, who knows if that note is in tune with the song? You've got to get rid of that. It's nice to have some sustain or some decay on a kick drum, but you want it kind of atonal. You don't want it to be a musical note, or you're going to go, what is that? There's something out of tune on the bass here. And it turns out it's the note that the kick drum has. It's very tricky when you get a kick drum with a front head without a hole, because it'll tend to have a note. You don't want a note.
I forget with a 22-inch kick drum, but the note is often something that's awkward for rock bands. Like it's like an F or an F sharp where that kick drum will like sing properly. And then it'll be just totally out of tune with like the 90% of the things that are like in E or D or something.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's like, don't waste my time on this. We've got to put a pillow on that. You've got to get a thump that sounds like, it's got to sound like you whacking yourself in the chest, like, a thump, not a boom, because that's just that's going to ruin your mix. It's going to be impossible. You're going to have to gate it or do something stupid. There's another case where you have to get the sound before it hits the microphone.
Yeah. I imagine there's some isolated cases in which, you could tune the kick to the key of the song and such, but in the context of making, rock records with conventional rock setups, that whole approach doesn't really make sense, where you have several songs in several different keys all in the same kit, and it's just a totally different style of record production.
If your entire album is in one key and it's, it's preposterous to me. The drums are a percussion instrument. They're not a note instrument. If they do have a note, like the toms can have a note, but the toms frequently will have a decaying note. It'll be like doom. You know what I mean? So I'm not in favor of the whole like tuning the drums to a note, because A, it'll change within 5 minutes of playing, and B, it may not be in tune as long as if your songs are all in exactly the same key. And furthermore, most stringed instruments, meaning guitars and bass, are actually 10 or 15 cents sharp a lot of the time while people beat on the strings, which is another issue that nobody seems to acknowledge.
Yes, whether you're when you plug into that tuner, are you tuning the attack or the sustain of the note? Because they could be two very different pitches within a few microseconds of each other.
Yes, and I wrote extensively about this on my website actually to try and make people think about it.
Yeah, I think I read an article you may have written years and years ago about the idea of roll off on kick drums, and you were talking about how 15 Ips tape kind of did that organically to kick drums. I think this was an article of yours. Does this sound familiar at all? Where you were talking?
I actually prefer the sound of 15 IPS. In the analog world, I always preferred 15 IPS actually, because I felt like 30 IPS analog tended to make guitars feel more screechy. I can't quite put my finger on why. And it tended to, especially smaller format machines like 30 IPS 16-track machines, 1-inch tape and so forth, it tended to roll off everything below 120 hertz.
Oh, interesting.
And so, which would really kind of, your low-end depth would just vanish. It would be a weird thing. You had to like do drastic EQ to compensate for it. Bigger 2-inch machines in the later era were better at 30 IPS, but
yeah, those were the ones I was used to.
I just like the sound of guitar at 15, and I like the sound of drums at 15. I don't like the sound of cymbals so much, but now we have digital, and I don't care.
Right. I have to admit that in mastering, when I sometimes do use tape, color and tape emulation to bring some gel to things, when there are records that need to sound a little bit more in your style, I often find myself going to 15 on them. Like when people are referencing some records where I'm like, this reminds me of a Jack Endino record, and things are just too digital, or like the low end extension is too weird on the kick drum, and then putting in 15, and all of a sudden you're kind of softening some of the edge on guitars, softening some of the edge on cymbals. You're getting this head bump and this roll off in the low frequency that just makes it feel more like the rock records that I grew up with and that a lot of these people grew up listening to and loving. Which brings me to asking you a little bit more about mastering, if that's okay. You've been doing more of that lately since the pandemic started. There's been, maybe fewer recording sessions than usual. And you said to me that you've been picking up some additional mastering work. How have you been approaching that? What kind of equipment are you using for mastering? What was that transition like for you? And are you doing it in the same kind of environment?
I'm doing it in the box, which is how I've been doing my mixing for 15 years anyway. So it's natural enough for me. The key, I've got a couple of EQ plugins that I go for, but mainly, a lot of the problem with mastering in the last couple of decades has been everybody wants to do the volume war thing. And, that's been discussed ad nauseum. And so most of that action in terms of getting that last couple dBs of volume without completely destroying the integrity of the music, that has to do with the brick wall limiting plugin that's at the very end of the signal chain. I've been mastering in the box, and I actually have been mastering for about 20 years, but I didn't really start taking it seriously until a few years ago because I kind of got tired of other mastering engineers screwing up my mixes.
Been there.
And I just said, enough of this nonsense. I need to start doing this myself. And then people just started sending me things to master, and now I keep pretty busy with it. So it's no longer just a case of like saving my own mixes from being destroyed. Now I'm, working on other people's stuff most of the time. And I still do a lot of mixing. But okay, the mastering thing I do in the box, which is how I've been mixing as well for at least 15 years. And I don't miss tape at all. It's the analog versus digital thing is kind of a red herring at this point. Yeah. So the thing with mastering is a lot of what's been going on for the last 20 years has been this volume war thing. It's been discussed ad nauseum, where everybody wants that last couple dB, where the average signal level is getting closer and closer to the peak signal level. Oh, here's your digital zero is up here, and the average level gets higher and higher in the dynamics peak signal level. Oh, here's your digital zero is up here, and the average level gets higher and higher, and the dynamics go away, and it starts to get more like a square wave. And it becomes a matter of taste because some people want it louder than God, and they will tell you, squash it, make it loud. I want it louder than the latest System of a Down record or whatever is the latest, stupid squash record du jour.
Well, there are some records where that's part of the tone. If you listen to like a Tame Impala record, like they're blown out and like that's part of the vibe, but there's certain records that you shouldn't do that to.
Well, and here's the thing that I always point out to people. I say, look, you didn't get to hear that record before it was mastered. You don't actually know what was done to it. Right. You might have liked it better a few dB lower, actually. It might have been easier to listen to and less fatiguing, but you weren't given that choice. You bought the record, it's slammed. That's the only version of it you're familiar with. Me as an engineer, I get to hear this stuff before and after. I know what damage has been done. So it's hard for me because, it's like a doctor, first do no harm, and I don't want to harm it, but at the same time, you got to please the client. So if they want it squashed, what I'll do is I'll give them a couple options. I'll do, okay, here's the one that's, this level, then here's a couple dB less, and I'll just send them a song like 3 different ways, maybe with 3 different limiter plugins. And I'll say, which one do you like? and I'll take the rest of the record in that direction. And the responses I get are all over the place. Yeah, it's important to give people options because it's personal taste. Now, because a lot of the action is happening from that last few dB of like, what do people want? I've basically collected limiter plugins. I have like 8 different brick wall limiter plugins that I can basically swap through in my setup. I'll say, okay, do you want the Oxford? Do you want the Pro L2? Do you want the Hoffa IQ limiter? I'm not a big fan of Waves, so I don't have the Waves plugins. There's a couple others that I switch through. DMG makes one. There's another one I'm going to try. DSP makes one. Mm-hmm. And, there's just various, I'll try anything really. And it's amazing. Again, there's no consistency in the one that some people want the one that sounds like it's pumping. Some people want the one that sounds like it's transparent. Some people want the crunchy one. Some people want the clear one. It's just funny, really. That's how mastering is. And I try to educate the clients, and I say, look, I'm going to give you some options. Just listen to it on an emotional level. Tell me which one rocks you the best and doesn't distract you with artifacts. And This is good. I'm not a big fan of stereo enhancement. In fact, if other mastering engineers do any sort of stereo enhancement on my mixes, I usually slap them down very quickly because I can tell instantly when I hear one of my mixes come back mastered. If somebody did a stereo enhancement on it, I go, wait, where's the vocal? Why are the guitars louder? What have you done? You've remixed my song. Take that off of there. Mm-hmm. That's not their job to remix my mixes.
Right.
So, I stay the hell out of that MS business as far as mastering goes. I just consider that it's a remix. If it was some disastrous mixing problem I had to solve with mastering, which I shouldn't be solving that with mastering, but if I had to, maybe I would do it. But that's not for someone else to do without me asking them to do on my mixes.
Right. Now, that's interesting. I can relate back when I was mixing, one of the things that happened to me again and again that I couldn't stand was working with kind of lower price and mid-level mastering engineers where it would just come back sounding worse. And
right.
It would either be like, I had a record that was a little bit on the bright side and I'm like, hey, if anything, we want to maybe just make sure we don't go any brighter than this. If anything, maybe you can add some girth in mastering and maybe just, reel in my excesses there and it would come back just even brighter. Or I've had the exact opposite happen. Like here's a relatively fat sounding record and they made it like ridiculously fat sounding to where it was super dark compared to other things next to it. I'm like, are you even listening to what records sound like, in your room? And I've had those experiences. But as a mastering engineer myself these days, it's interesting because I have 2 different types of clients. One of them are exactly what you're describing. Someone like yourself, they come to me and I want to do as little as possible. And I'm just doing a final QC and double checking a few things, making sure level from song to song works, making sure that there aren't, big changes in relative low end from song to song. But there are other artists with like, here are all of our favorite records. Here's what they sound like. Here's what ours sound like. And I'm like, there's a big gulf there. You got 2 options. One is mix it again or produce it again, or 2, I can do heavy-handed mastering, and here's what heavy-handed mastering sounds like. And sometimes people are thrilled with that, but you have to know which type of client is which. But it sounds like if you're getting things where you'd need to do heavy-handed, you want to send it back to them and say, this needs other work that I shouldn't be doing for you.
Right. And I'm not afraid to do that now because more and more people that I'm working with are mixing in the box. I know they are. Yeah. So actually going back and making a tweak is not as hard for them as it was in the analog era when you had to do a recall on the console or whatever. You didn't ask for remixes because it was practically impossible. Now I can say, look, you're this third song on the record, the guitar is way too quiet. There's no guitar in this compared with the other songs on the record. Why don't you go back and mix it with a little more guitar? Because I can play. It's way too quiet. There's no guitar in this compared with the other songs on the record. Why don't you go back and mix it with a little more guitar? Because I can play with the mid range here, but it's not going to be the same. Or for instance, you have no kick drum in song number 7. Compared with song number 6 and song number 8. And I can basically, they mixed the whole thing in a day or something and they just didn't quite catch that. And it's easy to have, all they need is for somebody else to point it out and they go, oh, you're right. Let me fix that. I'll send you a new mix. So in that sense, things are much easier now because you can get people to make mix tweaks more simply because the whole in the box thing just makes it way more practical. Just pop it open, make one adjustment, do a bounce, email it to me and we continue. Now, with mastering my own stuff, it's a nightmare because I will go back and remix after I master and remix after I master because I can. it's a terrible thing.
Yeah.
Mastering your own stuff is like do-it-yourself brain surgery. It's kind of dangerous. So, I have other mastering engineers. There's one named Chris Hanzik. I let Chris Hanzik master my mixes, but I do a lot of them myself if I have to.
Yeah. I hear you. It is one of these things where I really think you touched on one of the biggest values that a human mastering engineer can bring, which is this kind of mix feedback, mix coaching that you're able to provide for your mixing clients. Where in the same way as you being a producer, you could say, hey, the thing you really need to focus on here is the snare drum is all wrong for the song. The kick drum has too much note. Let's address that stuff. And these are probably things they didn't even think of or didn't even hear. You can do the same thing as a mastering engineer. And from your perspective of having heard thousands of great records, worked on probably hundreds, if not thousands of great sounding records, you can give them that mix feedback, which even on top of your mastering, maybe even a bigger part of the value that you can offer some of these people who are sending you their mixes is to get that impartial third party set of ears on it that can tell them what's going on and possibly how to address it, which they might not occur to them themselves.
Yeah, that's exactly true, actually, because, I'm trying to keep the big picture in mind.
Now, I want to ask you, if it's okay, one more question about mixing. I just want to ask you a couple of questions about mixing. I don't want to take your time all day. You've been extremely generous with your time, but I would love to get a quick sense for, as a mastering engineer working on other people's mixes, what do you think are some of the most common mistakes that new mixers are making that if they start focusing on and noticing sooner on into their craft, they'll start having better results?
Well, I think there's a lot of things you can do in mixing that compensate for a bad recording. But if people don't know they're making a bad recording, or they have a shitty guitar sound or a crappy drum sound, they won't fix it in the mix because they don't realize that it's actually not a very good sound that they recorded, because there's a lot of ways of compensating with EQ. Certain guitar tones can be really screechy and shrill, and you can zero in and find the spike. It might be at 3K or something. If you notch that, the whole thing suddenly becomes very warm. It doesn't hurt your ears when you turn it up. You can compensate for that with mixing. And people don't always do that, maybe because they're listening on, lousy monitors, most likely, or they're mixing on headphones, and, their ears have gotten tired. You're asking the most common mistakes in mixing, and I'm not sure there are any it's all over the map.
Each person messes up in their own unique way. That's totally fair and valid. So let me ask you a question.
The biggest problem is how they record.
Yes.
It's the recordings that are the problem.
So the biggest problem with mastering is bad mixes. The biggest problem with mixes is bad recordings. The biggest problem with bad recordings is probably bad players and bad bands, I'd imagine. But so, Jack, I just want to ask you a little bit about your approach in mixing now that you've been mixing in the box now for more than 15 years. What is your overall approach? Do you have like a multi-buses that you work through? Do you do bus processing on your master bus, on instrument subgroups? Are you doing most things on a track-by-track level? Can you just give us a big picture, kind of bird's eye view of what an overall approach to a mix looks like for a Jackendino in 2021?
Overall approach to a mix is similar to how I used to mix through a console, in that I generally have a global small reverb, a global big reverb, a global short delay, a global long echo. So those are like some auxes that I have at the bottom of the screen that are just like ready for whatever I want to send to them. It's like the default short, long, those things which are ready to be used for anything. And if I don't use them, I just deactivate them. And then the individual components, generally I'll have a designated vocal reverb and vocal delay. I'll have a designated drums reverb, short room kind of ambient thing ready to use that's only used on the drums. As far as submixing, if there's multiple guitar miking, which I tend to use a lot, I'll subgroup those together so that any edits I make is across the whole group. Obviously, anything that you want edits to go across a group, you got to subgroup those. And sometimes it's useful to have them all funneling through one submix, so you can put a global EQ or global compression across it. So if there's a lot of guitar mics, I'll subgroup those. The drums, I'll generally feed them through a stereo submix that allows me to put a global compressor across it if I feel that's the right thing to do, and a global reverb and a global EQ. One of the things that's nice if you run the drums through any kind of compressor is having an EQ after the compressor, because It allows you to like bump up the bottom octave of the drums without hammering the compressor too much. So yeah, I'll submix things. I don't automatically make subgroups of everything. That's kind of a waste of time. If there's 2 vocals, 2 guitars, why do I need submixes of those? But if I have a lot of mics, they get grouped and they might get fed through a submix. And then, I might or might not have a brick wall limiter across the mix bus. If I do, it's literally just catching the peaks, because I prefer to leave that for mastering. So anyway, that's the general approach that I take for mixing, and of course, individual components have individual compressors and EQs as needed. And I will generally gate all the toms by hand using the mouse. So that's the other thing. The snare and kick, I never gate those unless it's a disaster.
Cool. I have a great sense for it. I really appreciate the time you've taken today. We went through a lot of different places. We talked in depth about recording, about mixing, about mastering, all of which you can speak to, which is absolutely wonderful. You can find all of it in one guy. And I'm just curious, Jack, for people who are more familiar with your, most famous work from the 90s, what have been some of your favorite records that you've had the opportunity to work on the past 10 years? Anything that you feel like in the 20,000s or the 2010s or the 2020s that you felt really stood out as either something that was a pleasure to listen to or that you're just proud of as far as tones that you got?
Well, here's the thing. I'm not known as a metal guy, but Relapse Records kicks me a few records. Every year or two, they kick me a metal record. And I always have fun with those because they have a budget. So I can spend 2 weeks making a record, which I don't get to do for a lot of the bands next door that I work with here in Seattle. So, for instance, I did 2 records for Windhand that are very satisfying for me. They're big, heavy riff records, but I got to really work on the tones. The High on Fire record I did, which was, I think, their last record for Relapse. It was Death is This Communion in 2007. I think we had almost 3 weeks in the studio for that record, and I got to have a lot of fun with guitar tones on that one. It's Matt Pike, So that was really enjoyable. I've been doing a lot of mastering lately of old hip-hop records from Seattle that nobody got to hear originally. There's a lot of this stuff coming out of the vault, and that's really fun because I get to play with the low end a little bit. So, there's a lot of archival stuff that's been coming out in the last couple of years. Like, I've got to remix some old Mudhoney stuff that I had recorded in 1990 that was totally forgotten. And that ended up getting put on the deluxe Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge record. Has got 5 bonus tracks that I recorded 24 track in 1990, I think it was, that no one's ever heard before. That was really fun. There's, my own bands. This was a record that we made that came out in March of 2020. What could go wrong? This was Sky Cries Mary. It's another band that I'm in. This was a band called Purple Strange that I'm in right now. We made a CD and we went to make vinyl, and the vinyl is delayed until next August.
Yikes.
So we're kind of like, all right, well, I guess we better just start writing the next record. So, there's been a lot going on. I know you asked me about records from the last couple of decades. I have to pretty much go to my own discography on jackendino.com in order to jog my own memory on what the heck I've been doing for the last decade, because it's too many records and you probably won't have heard of most of them.
Right. That's the beautiful thing about working in music these days. There's no shortage of like good bands and well-recorded music these days. And to expect everyone to have heard of everything is impossible in this era, which was not the case in the 70s or 80s when, it took more significant budgets and people would be familiar with the same artist. But I'd say if you want to check out more of what Jack's been doing, check out his own bands. He mentioned a few of them. Purple Strange, Sky Cries Mary, Beyond Captain Orca, and his new record coming out this December of 2021 under his own name, Jack Endino. You got to check it out. Jack, it has been a bucket list moment to be able to talk to the great Jack Endino and pick your brains about mics and recording and mixing and even mastering now. So super excited. Go check out jackendino.com where you can find out more about him. And are you active on the social medias or any place where people should follow you if they want to keep more in touch with you?
Well, there's Jack Endino public page on Facebook. There's Jackendino Seattle on Instagram. I'm not super active on either of those, but I probably should be more active these days. I'm just too busy making records for people to do much
Fair enough.
on social media. I have a Twitter account and I never use it. So I just can't keep track of it. I can't keep up on that stuff because it would almost be a full-time job.
It's more, you're putting your energy in the more important places. So I respect and appreciate that. So wonderful having you here. Guys, Jack Endino, you got to check him out. He's been making tremendous records for longer than many of you who have been listening have been alive and making tremendous sounding records today. Check out his latest under his own name coming out this December 2021. We'll link to that in the show notes. Maybe I'll put a picture of the album cover up here on screen. Thank you, Jack, so much for joining us. Thank you guys for hanging out with us. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. See you next time.